Good evening, everyone. I extend a warm welcome to everyone present here today for our webinar on managing systemic and complex risks of disasters. I'm Abhilasha, and I'm currently working as a research fellow under Professor Upasana Sharma at the School of Public Policy, IIT Delhi. I'll be the rapporteur for today's webinar. This event is fourth in the series of 12 webinars that are being organized as pre-conference events leading to the 5th World Congress on Disaster Management, or 5th WCDM, scheduled to be held in New Delhi in November this year. WCDM has emerged as one of the largest conferences on disaster management in the developing world. It is an initiative of Disaster Management Initiatives and Convergence Society, or DMICS, which is based in Hyderabad. The first 4 editions of WCDM were held in Hyderabad, Visakhapatnam, and Mumbai on different themes. The theme this year is Technology, Finance and Capacity for Building Resilience to Disasters, with special reference to COVID-19. This theme would be discussed in 7 plenary sessions, 50 technical sessions, 10 special technical sessions, and 6 special feature events. This year, the conference is being hosted by the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, one of the premier research institutions in the country. The co-organizers of this webinar are the School of Public Policy, IIT Delhi, the All India Disaster Mitigation Institute, Ahmedabad, and the International Water Management Institute, Colombo. Our panel today on managing systemic and complex risks of disasters comprises globally renowned experts from India, Costa Rica, Switzerland, and Austria. We shall have 2 rounds of discussion to be moderated by Dr. P.G. Chakrabarty, who is a retired civil servant of India. He headed the National Institute of Disaster Management of India as its Executive Director, National Disaster Management Authority India as its Secretary, and Founder Director of SARC Disaster Management Center. He is also the Chairman of SPARES of Scientific and Technical Community of WCDM. I would now hand over to Dr. Chakrabarty to commence the event.
Thank you. So we have a very distinguished panel today to discuss a very critical and important issue, managing systemic and complex disasters, which assumes great significance in the context of the COVID-19. Scientific assessment of risks of disasters is a relatively recent phenomena. It started with the publication of the report of the World Commission on Environment and Development in the late 80s, continued throughout the international decade for natural disaster reduction in the 90s, and further broadened and strengthened during the Yogo decade of building resilience of countries and communities to disasters. It has now entered a new phase of comprehensiveness, vigor, and sophistication during the post-2015 momentum of transforming the world, reflected in the Sendai Framework, Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and the New Urban Agenda. So the linear analysis of hazards, vulnerabilities, and exposures have given way to new analysis of entire gamut of underlying risks of disasters, ranging from climate change, urbanization, and growing inequalities to environmental degradation and loss of biodiversity, financial volatility, volatility, and cyber risks in an increasingly globalized and interconnected world. All these new risk drivers are interacting with each other to create new risks of disasters, precipitating existing risks and creating complex and systemic risks that are not confined to any sector, community, or country, but engulfing the entire global community. A tiny virus originating from a distant market in the Far East has traveled far wide, affecting every community and country across continents, killing millions, destroying livelihood, and disrupting economies of even the most advanced countries of the world. Now, how do you assess these systemic and complex risks of disasters? How do you reduce the risks of such disasters? What institutional and financial arrangements can be made to govern these risks? How do you deploy human, material, and financial resources to prevent and mitigate these risks? Can we develop an early warning system to be prepared for such disasters? How do you respond to such disasters? How do you recover from such disasters? These are some of the very difficult questions that cannot be answered during the course of just 90 minutes discussion, but certainly we can get a feel of what is the best minds of the world are thinking on the subject. So we have this 90 minutes discussion. The first round of discussion, the panelists will get about 6 to 7 minutes time to give their broad perspectives, and the follow-up round will be an interaction among the panelists and with the audience. So we have a very distinguished panel, as I said. So I would invite Andrew Musgrave, who is we are very fortunate to have him here. He is one of the most renowned names in the disaster risk assessment. He had been the general coordinator of the LARAID, the Network for Social Sciences, Social Studies and Disaster Prevention in Latin America. He was a member of the IDNDR, Scientific and Technical Committee, Chief of the Disaster Reduction Unit in the UNDP, and coordinator of the Global Risk Assessment Team in the UNISDR. He directed 5 consecutive editions of the Global Assessment Report on Disaster Reduction and developed the innovative global risk model. He was also lead author for the special report on managing risk of extreme events of the IPCC. He worked as advisor to the Reconstruction Authority of the Government of Peru and the Global Center for Disaster Statistics in Japan. Presently, he is leading the Risk Nexus initiative, which he founded as a partnership of leading institutions engaged in risks, sustainability, and resilience. Over to you, Andrews.
Okay, thank you very much. Greetings to everyone from Costa Rica, where it's 8:40 in the morning. So good evening to all the colleagues in India. We're completely on the opposite side of the world. And many thanks to Da Chakrabarti for this opportunity to be with you today. So I only have, I think, 6 minutes. So I'm going to summarize really what I'm going to say. I think we all understand the concept of systemic risk. I mean, the difference between systemic risk and asset risk, and the issues of non-linearity, interdependence, geographical and temporal discontinuity and uncertainty around the whole concept of systemic risk. So I'm not going to go in so much into the conceptual side, but I'm just going to really focus in on 3 issues, which I think are important if we're going to actually turn systemic risk from an academic concept into something that's actionable. And when I say actionable, it's something that local and national governments can do something about. So the 3 issues I'm going to discuss, the first one is to do with scale, the second has to do with causality, and the third has to do with agency. So with respect to scale, the Risk Nexus Initiative produced a paper that was published by UNDP earlier this year on systemic risk. And one of the things we looked at in this paper, we really did a literature search on the main focus of both research and policy into dealing with systemic risk. And to summarize, I mean, I think the focus up to now has really been on extreme, unforeseen global hazards affecting strategic economic sectors, global supply chains, and particularly the financial system or the financial sector. I think we all know that, I mean, really the sort of concept of systemic risk, I mean, it's been around for a long time, but it really came out of the closet during the global financial crisis of 12 years ago. But I think something that's missing in the discussion on systemic risk is really the idea that, it can manifest at any scale. It doesn't have to be at the global scale. Yeah, it can manifest at the regional scale, at the national scale, and at the local scale. So one of the points, I think important points we make in this paper is that for most people in the developing world, let's say in low and middle income countries, the quotidian expression of systemic risk they experience is really through the collapse of local infrastructure systems and local ecosystem services, things that really affect their living conditions, their livelihoods, and sometimes their lives. I mean, in the village I live in Costa Rica, if a storm knocks down an electricity electricity cable or a transmission tower, and the whole electricity goes down in the neighborhood, then we also will have problems with water. Small businesses might have problems because their deep freezers don't work and so on and so forth. So on scale, yes, I mean, there are unforeseen global hazards affecting global supply chains and strategic economic sectors. But for most people in the world, let's say the experience they have of systemic risk, which is as equally valid as at the global level, is really through, as I said, ripple effects in local infrastructure systems and local ecosystem services. So that's really just the first point I'm going to make about scale. The second issue I'm going to talk about is causality. Again, if we look at both the academic literature and the sort of the policy papers that have been produced on systemic risk, the focus is really still very much on the hazards affecting exogenously on systems which are sort of presumed to be in some sort of equilibrium. And we really put forward in the paper this a sort of a counter view, in a sense, for systemic risk. As any other kind of risk, I mean, even a very simple asset risk is also socially constructed, which means that its components, hazard, exposure, and vulnerability are also socially constructed. So if one takes the sort of the COVID pandemic as an example, clearly the sort of the triggering pathogen, I mean, the sort of the pathogen itself was also probably socially constructed. There's obviously still debate going on as to whether this was through human or animal interactions or something that escaped from a laboratory, but it was certainly socially constructed one way or another. But if we actually look at the pandemic itself, we don't really understand what happened unless we really look at the patterns of how people were exposed to the pandemic through their living conditions, and how they were vulnerable to the pandemic as well, particularly due to access to adequate public health facilities. I think we all saw in April the scenes in Delhi as people were desperately trying to get access to oxygen. So again, I think we need to, if we're going to actually understand systemic risk and learn how to deal with it, we need to move away from this almost, I would say, exclusive focus on the hazard, and move much more to a focus on how the conditions, underlying conditions of exposure and vulnerability are also socially constructed. And one of the things, if one looks at manifestations of systemic risk across different countries, one tends to see that often it's the same social groups that are affected, irrespective of what the hazard event is. So irrespective of whether it's a pathogen, whether it's a conflict, whether it's a physical hazard or whatever, it's often the same groups of people in society that get affected, which again brings us back to this notion, but we really need to pay much more attention to vulnerability. And in terms of the last point I want to make, I think I've still got 2 minutes left, in terms of agency. This subject, systemic and complex risk, is not yet on the agenda of most governments in low and middle income countries. Yeah. When we wrote this paper, we did several interviews with people in government we knew, and people had a sort of a hazy idea of what it may be, but no idea at all as to what it had to do with them and their sort of day-to-day business. So if this is going to make any sense as a concept, we have to frame it in a way that people can do something about it, that they can actually address, have agency over. And there's really, I think, three points here. The first point is, in most countries, and I don't think this has changed since the end of the Hyogo framework and when we moved over to the Sendai framework in 2015, most countries still haven't been successful in dealing with asset risk. Yeah. So it's like saying, if I can't protect my electricity transmission towers, which are assets, how on earth am I going to protect the sort of, knock-on systemic non-linear effects throughout the areas where that electricity network serves? So it means that, systemic risk is far more complex, but if we can't yet deal with asset risk, it's unlikely we're going to be able to deal with systemic risk. The second thing relates again to the causality issue. We need to pay much more attention to the exposure and to the vulnerability, and not just the hazard. It's not saying the hazard is not important, but the other two are equally important. And again, if I use the COVID example here, I mean, the main response globally has been vaccination. And I'm not against vaccination. I'm fully vaccinated and believe in vaccines. So I'll put that on the table. But how many countries have used this as an opportunity to strengthen their public health systems, which would be to really a measure, for example, to address the vulnerability side of the equation? One doesn't read about countries reinvesting to strengthen their public health systems. Something which would be useful to, again, not just to protect against future pandemics like COVID, but against other kinds of diseases, strengthening strengthening resilience against other kinds of hazards, conflict, etc. And the third point in terms of agency is, again, let's not lose sight of local infrastructure systems and local ecosystem services, which is how most people in the developing world experience quotidian risk. Really strengthening these is probably the most relevant action we could have for addressing the SDGs. Remember the SDGs, I think a lot of us have forgotten about the SDGs, but they're still there and they're still relevant. So I think if we want to link a discussion on systemic and complex risk with the SDGs, let's focus on how we can actually strengthen the resilience and reduce systemic risk at the local level in developing countries. And I think we sincerely believe this would also help to then reduce risk at the global level, in the sense that anything that's done locally also has a global impact. So I've used up my 6 minutes, so I'll stop there and look forward to intervening again in the second round. Thank you very much for your attention.
So thanks, Andrews, for your remarks. So may I request Scott Williams? So Scott is the coordinating lead author of the UN Global Assessment Report on Disaster Risk Reduction 2019 and also the forthcoming report of 2022. His study focusing on the systemic nature of the risks. He's a leading systems innovation advisor in the UNDP, working on energy, COVID-19, food system security, disaster risk management, financial sector transformation, and more. He holds or has recently held board positions with Resurgence, Oasis, Loss Modeling Framework, Resilience Brokers, and Icebreaker One. Scott is currently exploring the implications of the systemic nature of risk for learning, managing, and governing at all levels in society. Over to you, Scott.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today at this important event. I'd like to start with a brief musing by Michael Leunig, from a book called The Curly Pajama Letters. What seems to be vital is whether or not the day is spacious, in which case the roundedness of the day is perhaps the most important factor. After all, a round day holds happiness most successfully, happiness itself being of a rounded shape, as you have observed. The shortest day always reminds me that life is short, but no sooner am I conscious of that than I am reminded that life is also very long. This is a most comforting paradox, for when I know that life is short, it seems more precious and sweet, and I'm overcome with a great sense of forgiveness, and my sufferings seem more bearable and fleeting. In fact, they almost feel like blessings. And when I know that life is long, I am reassured and contented that the great wheel will surely turn, and natural justice will come to pass, most certainly. But once again, Vasco, it is not the length of life which is important. It is the shape and the spaciousness, for therein lies the potential for a beautiful freedom. It is the roundedness of life which matters. A round life is surely a happy life, and dare I say, it is a good life. Please consider these reflections as a small picnic of thoughts that we may share together. And that may be a whimsical musing from a poetic voice. Spaciousness to think differently, spaciousness to care differently. to embrace a shift from the thingification and the use of terms like systemic risk, complex risk, or compound risk, and to embrace the systemic nature of risk and the systemic nature of life. But this requires a fundamental shift in the way that we perceive our reality. We need to shift our perceptions. As a dear friend often asks, how do you draw the smell of basil? A 4-year-old knows how. A 30-year-old or a 60-year-old rarely does, because we get stuck in our cognitive grooves. And we do need to find ways out of these grooves, to find new ways to groove together, perhaps. The difficulties that Andrew and Dr. Chakrabarti have outlined that we are called to work on are systemic in nature. They're not about problems to be solved. They are paradoxes to be explored. This is not about the technology or the finance, the data, the energy. These are within the relationships, within the business models, within the economic models, the political systems, the education systems, the history, and ultimately within the culture. And all of these are descriptions of each other, and all of them are in relationship with each other, and they are all constantly changing in stochastic ways that are both ordered and in chaos. Shifting perceptions to be able to see these relational processes holds the possibility of shifting everything. Our perceptions are very intimate, and each human's complexity in each of the places that we exist in this world is very particular. And each human is evolutionarily biased to establish habits over time that, if unchallenged, become hard programmed, largely invisible and mostly non-conscious in our daily life. When enough time passes, these cognitive shortcuts, which we use to make sense of our reality, become addictions to the way that things have been. And this addiction then becomes culture. And it is this culture that is driving the visible processes, that is driving this unending quest for measurable solutions, for modeled, perfectly modeled outcomes. But visible or measurable change is not where changes occur within living systems, within complex adaptive systems, like societies, communities, human beings. The changes are always somewhere else. Thinking and acting in complexity and embracing the systemic nature of risk, as Andrew mentioned, which occurs at all scales, requires the ability to perceive across multiple perspectives and multiple contexts simultaneously. Such an ability is not a muscle, though, that has been trained into us in our education systems or institutionalized into us in our working worlds. It's quite the opposite, actually. But it is a skill which is within each of us, abductive thinking, and it is acutely needed to meet the complexity of the multiple crises simultaneously, to improve the conditions for the vitality of life in our communities, and to recalibrate our relationships with life. In short, to reduce risk. To acknowledge suffering and embrace humility, care, and compassion for all life. From our colleagues, those in our community, to river systems, coral reefs, forests, and more that we are in relationship with and that we depend on for life. I believe that we need practice spaces to experiment, to go beyond the quest for clear and distinct ideas, modelled outcomes, and measurable solutions. For all of us to become more able to perceive the relationshiping and the interdependencies within every part of life at all times. This is rigorous and robust work, but it's also seriously playful, with plenty of space for humility and curiosity and a renewing of integrity, for affection and the acknowledgement and the respect of all life, even the messy bits that we often try to suppress, but which remain in areas that maybe we choose not to look. These safe practice spaces can help us to recognize the edges of our assumptions and the biases that we hold in supported ways that we can then move more confidently towards the edges, so that we can get off tired old scripts, hard programmed habits, and share our intimate stories. This is where mutual learning can take place, in this liminal space where the edges were, where things seemed permanent, but they never were. where our perceptions can shift and the new combinings can open up unprecedented possibilities for people to go deeper into their humanity, into their complexity, into their context, and into their relationships. I see this as a new ecology of communication, embracing and not attempting to suppress the systemic nature of risk. With care, with love, with determination, with all of our experience, and with spaciousness. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott, for your remarks, your very philosophical approach in the entire issue of systemic risks. So let us hear Dr. Susan Angerkop. She's holding a dual positions as a researcher at the International Institute of Applied Science Systems Analysis in Austria, and as a lecturer in the Department of Environmental Systems Science at Zurich, where from she earned her doctoral degree. At Aisha, she is currently leading the project Water Stress 80, exploring climate change-induced water stress by means of participatory modeling, and is involved in the Pathways project, designing adaptation pathways in the context of flood risk management. She is also actively involved in developing systems analysis course and is a chapter lead author for the Global Assessment Report for Disaster Risk Reduction 2022. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you very much. Well, I have a much more specific message, maybe, and one that's very dear to my heart. It might sound a bit simple, but what I think, or what in my work has come across so far as to me most useful in dealing with systemic risks or complex risks, is one tiny baby step maybe at approaching things. And that is that we need to be clearer what we talk about when we talk about risks. And what I mean by that is not that we need to be clear about the context, even though we know that that is crucially important, right? Context matters when we talk about risk. And I'm not talking about, the difference between risk and uncertainty, even though that is a question that I think still has not been fully resolved across sectors. And I'm also not talking about finding one universal definition for risks or for systemic risks. I'm not even sure if we have a really satisfying definition for systemic risk at the moment anyway. I'm talking about something much more basic and fundamental, and that is that we need to be able to, at the beginning of any conversation that we have about risks, to try and be specific about, or as specific as we can, about whether we are talking about the probability of a certain cause to cause a set of impacts, or whether we are talking about the probability for a certain impact to happen. Because what I found so far is that people seem to struggle with that. And I guess in many contexts it's not important, right? Because we have a lot of research areas, a lot of policy fields, a lot of sectors, such as the insurance sector, where it's very clear what we talk about when we talk about risk. But at the same time, and I think the speakers before me have made that abundantly clear, when we talk about systemic risks, we talk across disciplines. We are not multidisciplinary anymore. We are interdisciplinary. We are transdisciplinary. We talk about sectors. We talk about crossing departmental divides, etc. So all of a sudden, it becomes crucially clear that we understand each other. And when it comes to risk being such a topic that's so universally used, both in our day-to-day language, but also in our different disciplines and in our different settings, we tend to assume a lot and way too much, actually, about when we talk about risks. And I've come across a lot of areas, for example, climate mitigation, and that becomes visible, for example, in IPCC chapters, etc., where it's just simply not as clear what we talk about when we talk about risks. So, for example, when people talk about policy risks in climate mitigation policy, they sometimes talk about something like an investment risk, really, right? So what are the obstacles when it comes to investing into renewable energy technologies, for example? You know, what are the costs of adapting to climate change? And sometimes when people talk about policy risks, they talk about the actual potential negative impacts that might happen as a consequence of implementing any kind of transition policy or impact. So there's a lot of different ways we can talk about risk. And this is just one example that I have sort of systematic evidence for, because I have a large scale systematic literature review that has horribly failed on this matter. We've reviewed, reduced 10,000 of articles to 700 articles that we reviewed in detail with many, many researchers across disciplines, and it completely failed because we were all not able, even though we just talked for a long time, to articulate what we're talking about when we talk about risks. And also the authors were not really able to do that. So for each of those research articles, you would have to, you know, really dig deep, read between the lines, etc., until you then would finally understand what people talk about when they talk about risks. So what I suggest as one, you know, small step towards managing systemic risks that go across sectors, across disciplines, across policy fields, is to just start and learn to be very specific about what we talk about when we talk about risks. There can be at different levels, at different scales, and then it has slightly different meanings. But I'm talking about this few very fundamental questions. And that is part, obviously, of a bigger picture that's talking about knowledge integration and the spaciousness that Scott has mentioned that we need in terms of when we communicate and work together in potentially entirely new ways to manage, I sometimes call them just fancy risks as well. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So may I request our next speaker? So Anna, please.
Yes, so good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everyone. A warm welcome to all the participants who follow us online, and let me thank you, and thank you especially Upasna Sharma for inviting me to this event and this discussion. I'm a senior researcher at the University of Geneva in Switzerland, and I'm working now for 15 years on topic linked to risk governance, but also risk perception, communication, and decision-making processes. So after all these really wonderful reflections from the previous speakers, I will just add two remarks. One is linked to the question on how can we improve our systemic risk governance capacities. And the second one is again on how can we improve, however, this time our systemic risk analysis capacities. So the first point, so systemic risk governance, several cases, and COVID is one of them, shows how a global threat that has been on the radar, let's say, of national government and United Nations institutions for several years now, can just still take us unprepared. And even if emergency plans were often readily available, they were either left in the drawers or were not addressing the key problems that we have been then facing when COVID has arrived, and in some cases almost by surprise. So to improve our governance capacities for risks like COVID that immediately go and affect our societies at the systemic level, we need more cross-sectoral and cross-level cooperation. So what does this mean? This means that, first of all, we need to break silos, as mentioned by other speakers, silos between different disciplines, silos between different types of knowledge, but also silos between different sectors, most notably the public and private sector, that do not work together. But also, you know, in the public sector, when you start to analyze cases of enablers of successful governance of systemic risk, you see that when sectors that do not usually cooperate and work together start to work together, you have more effective results and solution for risk reduction. So let me make an example, a negative and a positive one, an example of lack of cooperation. For example, in the case of COVID, we have seen that in many cases, the education sector was unprepared to face the emergency. Were there plans in place on how to switch from one day to the other to, you know, the old school system to online teaching? And how could this education system be more prepared if they would have interacted more with all the risk management systems that we have in place? So civil protection and others. So it's a negative case, let's say, on how lack of cooperation is not helping us to improve our governance, systemic risk governance capacities. But we also have some other positive cases. For example, for disaster risk reduction, the implementation of nature-based solutions, which are solutions that address multiple benefits and provide multiple benefits at the same time. They are able to mitigate climate risk, for example, to reduce flood and disaster risk in some cases. So this type of solutions desperately need the cooperation among sector in the public agencies, but also between the public and private sector that usually do not work together. So therefore, so this first point was really focused on, you know, the need to improve our capacities to work across different levels, also of government, municipal and regional authorities, and between different sectors and stakeholders to really implement better systemic governance solutions. The second point is on the need to improve systemic and integrated risk analysis capacities. So this is more on the quantitative aspects of risk assessment. I'm not a natural scientist nor somebody that has been working on quantitative risk assessment. However, I've been extensively cooperating and working together with engineers and natural scientists that use hard data. And to really be able to assess and reduce systemic risks, we need data that also are able to support us for a better and more integrated risk management solutions. This data need to be collected very often at the local level, but then the missing link and what we really still need to do a lot of research about, but not only research, then implement it in practice, is really in the interactions between different risks. And here we have several examples. One can be, all the crises, the big crises that are critically affecting our life support system, the climate crisis, now health crisis like COVID and other pandemics, and the biodiversity crisis. So these three crises are linked, and we know, and I can tell you more later on how these three systems are interlinked, but most of the time we have just qualitative evidence, and there is a lack of information to really take the needed action. So these were the 2 points that I would like to bring for further discussion, and I will be happy to develop this more in the next session.
In the first round, we had your perspectives, general perspectives. So in the second round, we would like to know that what needs to be done. We had only 5 years back these 2015 Agenda for Development, and these are all were discussed globally, and after a lot of deliberations we finalized it. And so soon after 5 years we are facing this kind of a complex risk, and the entire world seems to be unprepared. So what actually needs to be done? Because your risk assessment framework that was developed over the years, and it has percolated down to the national level, to the local level, and we are all talking about hazard, vulnerabilities, risk, and these concepts are now percolated down to the local level. But people are not really understanding that what is this kind of uncertainties, and what are these kind of complex risks which are emerging, and why this could not be anticipated earlier, why we are not prepared for that, why we are so unprepared despite so much of efforts being made. The normal systems for early warning, etc., why it didn't work, why we are not so prepared, why you could not prevent this kind of colossal loss to the human lives and miseries. So what went wrong actually? Because we have a brand new system. Sendai is just 5 years old, so also SDGs and everything. But whole world seems to be so unprepared to deal with this risk despite all the efforts we have been making all these years. So Andrews, could you please reflect? Your reflection, please. Yeah.
Unmute. Yeah, I think it comes back to something I said in my presentation at the beginning, that we obviously are becoming more and more aware of systemic risk, more and more aware of all the interconnections, the interdependencies, the uncertainties. The COVID pandemic's obviously brought all that into sharp relief, but it's not the first manifestation of systemic risk. We shouldn't have needed COVID to point this out to us. But the trouble is, I think, still at the, as you rightly pointed out, at the national and local level, most countries still have enormous difficulties in even managing the most simple manifestations of just, let's say, conventional asset risk. Yeah. The capacities to do anything else other than basic disaster response and emergency management simply aren't in place. And there's a big difference between what often is happening at the national government level, which is obviously the normative level, where we may have very, very sophisticated institutional systems, laws, technical guidelines, planning systems, etc., being developed and put into place. But when we look at how those are actually translated into action at the local level, where we're often, as I said, obviously talking here about local governments, there's usually a huge, let's say, gap between one and the other. So between the national level, which is, as I said, the normative level, through to the local level, which is really the implementation level. So one of the things which I think we need to really put on the table, and it's always, you go to countless meetings and it's always mentioned as the problem, but no one really seems to know how to address it, is really how can we start strengthening capacities for what in Latin America is called territorial governance, which is really how we manage, our land, our natural resources, our space and our relationships in ways that don't construct new risk, but actually help to sort of reduce existing risks and don't construct new ones. So I think what we're looking at here is we don't particularly need a new kind of governance called systemic risk governance. I'm not even sure if we really need a specialized field called risk governance. I think what we still need to do is actually just do old-fashioned, if you like, territorial planning, territorial governance at the local level in a way that actually enables us as we develop not to generate new risks and to reduce existing ones. And I still believe that's probably the biggest challenge we have ahead of us. It doesn't matter how many new, let's say at the national level, specialized directorate on systemic risk is created, if we're not actually strengthening local capacities to address the processes on the ground which are generating risk. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.
There is a systemic risk, but there is systemic failure also. You find that even the most advanced countries in the West, they also fail to deal with this risk, anticipate the risk, be prepared for the risk. So why this systemic failure all around for dealing with these risks?
I'm happy to make a comment there. And it does build off what Andrew is saying about place-based approaches. And I see two really fundamental issues which I was alluding to, I guess, in my opening remarks. We maintain an economic system which is based on discounting our future and the objectification of relationships, of the natural functioning of living systems of human beings in their communities. If we maintain an economic system which is based on objectification and discounting the future, then we're in serious trouble. Combined with that, though, is the perpetuation of a nation-state approach to governing that which we are talking about here. A nation-state system which only reinforces a narrative, an underlying metaphorical construct of separation and othering. I am Australian, you are Indian, he is American, she is Austrian. Nonsense. It's all nonsense. And it is very important that we actually are able to have discourse about this, because, and Gregory Bateson back in 1971 wrote this amazing statement, which I think is critically important for what we're talking about here today. I'll just read it briefly to you. He said, if we continue to operate in terms of a Cartesian dualism of mind versus matter, we shall probably also continue to see the world in terms of God versus man, elite versus people, chosen race versus others, nation versus nation, and man versus environment. It is doubtful whether a species having both an advanced technology and this strange way of looking at its world can endure. This strange way of looking at our world. We have lost that sense that Indigenous communities all around the world still hold in both their oral traditions and their embodied living practices, similar to what Andrew was saying, territorial approaches to governance. These are approaches which are invested in flexibility to be able to deal with the potentiality of change associated with living with complexity, which in many instances, particularly when you get to the normative national level, or heaven forbid the intergovernmental level where I work and spend a lot of my time, there is this delusion of an insulation from consequences because of all the different layers which are in between the statements, the reports, the analysis, and as Andrew rightly pointed out, the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground, in many indigenous languages, there are no words for risk or uncertainty. There are only words for protection, for generosity, reciprocity, for being there for each other, for all life, respecting all life, and not drawing artificial boundaries which then allow us to analyze and create solutions for parts of problems which all they do is relocate those problems to other places which are maybe less visible, less manageable, less controllable, and definitely less with less access to finance, resources, and other tools that are needed. So I would say this continuing sort of meta-narrative that is prevalent across the majority of the world and the governance systems of the world of separation and othering, combined with this objectification which is built into our economic system. These need to be addressed. We need to speak of these. And I am not seeing this happening in any of the major discussions into the midterm review processes for the major 2015-2030 agreements, in any of the intergovernmental or governmental discussions, private sector or financial conversations that I'm in at the moment.
So now, we have the systemic crisis, we have the systemic failures, but we have some opportunities also, maybe systemic opportunities. In a globalized, interconnected world where no community is isolated from others, so you have the cascading effect of risk affecting the entire countries and communities. But at the same time, the way we are connecting in the globalized world, that provides us certain opportunities also, the new technology and others. So do you think that there are systemic opportunities also for dealing with this kind of systemic crisis? Susan?
I think this is a more difficult question now. I agree with what the Andrew and Scott have said, in that, and I would just put it in different words, is that we are sort of stuck in past dependencies of our different systems, and it's so hard to get out of that. But it's definitely all a result of of continuously working in dimensions and with concepts and systems that just make things worse than better, to put it very shortly. I do think that there are opportunities, but they in a connected world, and that is that hopefully good ideas travel faster when we are connected and communicate, and I think that's what we have to rely on, because I also have no solution at the technical level, at the purely technology level. I think we obviously, it's good to get better at analyzing the problems that we have, that we're in, and I guess our models help us do so when they get better and when we find more data, etc. But that's not the solution, as Scott said. That's not what we really what we need to solve where we're stuck at. And I also see the solutions in creating spaciousness individually, and in talking to each other differently, in communicating more openly, and taking more time for that, and putting value to that, and seeing that, right? I mean, it needs a real definition of the kind of roles that we also have, both within research and outside of research. And I think maybe the term, as I mentioned before, knowledge integration holds some promise there. I don't know whether it's sufficient. I'm trying to break it down to a few more things that sound maybe slightly less philosophical than how Scott puts it, or slightly less esoteric. But I think in the end it comes down to those same definitions. If you ask for how we can take opportunities in a connected world, in a more global world.
So if you look at it from another angle, then and compare, for example, COVID-19 with the Spanish flu, and you see that the kind of devastations that had taken place 100 years back, about 50 million people died. Compared to that, we are just about less than 5 million as yet. But we have the vaccinations developed so quickly, and the world, some parts of the world are recovering, and then there are hopes that there will be new innovations, drugs, etc. coming, and so pandemic would be coming to a close. So there are, just as there are systemic failures, there are also there are a lot of positives, a lot of systemic opportunities are created. And if you look at the entire global scenario in terms of the literacy, the basic health coverage, the shelter, despite the growing population, within the same systemic constraints, we have been able to deliver poverty reduction, for example, countries like China and India, and some of the things that SDGs that you have set, the goals. So some of these are quite achievable, and then so I think despite the crisis that is being created, within the same constraints, we are able to achieve much more, and the system has, to a certain extent, has become more resilient historically than what it used to be in the past. Don't you see some kind of positivities in that, positive angles? Scott, you don't agree?
No, I don't. I think this focus on the focus on the elements of the system as opposed to the relationships and the relationality between all the different parts of the systems of which we are a part was and is still much more advanced in indigenous communities than it is in so-called modern or developed or progressive nations, where the prevalence of measures of success based on the objectification of life and the elimination rather than the nourishing of those relationships creates fragilities which are pushed back by artificial measures such as risk financing and insurance. But they don't actually contribute to the overall regenerative capacity or resilience of living systems. And as a result of the consequences of the actions that have been pursued through both that separation narrative and the infinite growth, discounting the future economic model that have been prevalent over the last few hundred years, we have introduced such significant consequences into our lived realities right now, let alone what is about to engulf us in the next 3, 5, 10, 20 years. I think COVID response is an excellent example of what Andrew was talking about, which is a techno-optimistic approach that somehow a vaccine for a specific strain of a specific pandemic is in any way a panacea for a fundamental rethinking and reinvestment in the conditions of the system in which we exist, be that the investment in healthcare to be able to deal with. Already we're seeing vaccine resistance already, and the variants have only just begun. Already we're seeing the issues with vaccine apartheid, creating the conditions for concentrations of new variant creation and formation and mutation in communities. And then because of that interconnected world and the fact that we refuse to stop international air travel, we are seeing that transmission through into fragile, unprepared environments. Because we are not focusing on, we don't nourish our relationships. We don't value the relationships. We value the annihilation of relationships and the objectification of relationships. And I think that creates less resilience and much greater fragility.
Yeah. So there are some few questions from the audience. One question is that the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, it didn't have a mention about the pandemics and the systemic risks. So, so indeed, it doesn't make any mention, but I think what do you
It
think?
does. It actually does. The Sendai framework does, as Andrew knows much better than me. It dramatically expands the scope of hazards considered, including zoonotic diseases. It specifically was significantly expanded in scope from natural hazards to include man-made, technological, biological, and others. So it specifically does include them, I would say. Maybe Andrew, you would comment on that, but.
Yes, I mean, I think that was one of the principal changes from Hyogo to Sendai was sort of expanding the sort of dictionary of hazards that was covered from basically physical, I mean, hydrometeorological and geological hazards to include, biological, technological, and I think it was the word used was man-made. I remember from the negotiations amongst the member states, they wanted conflict to be specifically excluded because otherwise it was going to bog down the entire framework. But yeah, so there is that dramatically expanded dictionary of hazards in the framework. But how that's actually, let's say, impacted in national systems for risk management, I'm not sure. My impression is in most of the countries I work with, their real day-to-day focus hasn't changed. I mean, they're still struggling to deal with as I said, the geophysical or the hydromet hazards, and are still struggling to deal with asset risk without looking at broader systemic manifestations of risk. So again, there's a sort of a difference between, what is the discourse at the international level and what's the sort of a reality on the ground. So it's not the fault of the Sendai framework. The Sendai framework's got all sorts of scope for doing all sorts of things. But the way it's been interpreted at the national level, I think is still stuck in a mold from even probably predating Hyogo.
So there is another question from the audience that, we have the multi-hazard early warning system. So is it possible to develop the early warning for epidemics and pandemics and integrate this with the multi-hazard early warning system?
Can I come in again there,
Yeah.
Dr. Chakravarti?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, again, I think it relates back to something I said earlier on, which is this sort of excessive focus on the hazard, in the case of COVID, on the pathogen, rather than on the underlying conditions of exposure and vulnerability. If we put all our efforts into trying to predict where the next pathogen is going to come from, where it's going to arise and how it's going to work, we could spend, all sorts of, expend a lot of our neurons and brain cells on that without necessarily coming up with an answer. I fully agree with Scott. It's coming and will come in many different forms. But the underlying conditions of exposure and vulnerability, they're there now. I mean, we can see them. So if one actually had, say, mapped out seriously the capacity of primary and secondary healthcare systems around the world to deal with pandemics in general, or conflict, or the effects of hazards, probably would have been able to pinpoint quite closely where we were going to get a lot of the excess deaths in the case of the COVID pandemic. And if we were looking at where people were living in, crowded living conditions or forced to work in occupations which exposed them to the pathogen, the same. So I think, having a multi-hazard warning system is great, but the warning system also needs to warn about the sort of underlying conditions of exposure and vulnerability. Those are very easy to study. We don't need sort of, a highly sophisticated system to be able to, map. We can, with the information we have, we could map now down to a great detail what weaknesses, as I said, in national and local health systems. So why don't we do that rather than focusing all our attention on where the next pathogen is going to come? It's going to come. We don't know in what shape or form or where it's going to come from, but the same health systems are going to be affected. So I think, again, we need to, in a sense, change the way we understand early warning systems if we're going to be successful in that.
So, Upasana, you have a question, please ask it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dhar. So I've been listening with rapt attention to this very interesting discussion. And what I gather from this is that, what is probably at the root cause is this tension between these centralizing tendencies of a system, a global system, vis-a-vis the loss of agency at the local levels, which probably is an underlying reason for why we are so underprepared, even for asset risks. Forget about systemic risks. Yeah. So how does one actually think about? I think what is missing is this. So there, on one side, there's this whole range of global models, some more sophisticated than the other, and people are working on these, looking at interconnected biogeospheres and all those systems, trying to understand how they're connected and how risks cascade into other systems and so on. And at the other end, there we know that the impacts are really felt at the local level, and the preparedness needs to be at the local level. And it is at the local level we are most underprepared, very often because of loss of agency that has occurred over a period of time. In some places has been there historically, in other places it's more recent because of globalizing tendencies. So how do we start thinking of actually bringing in this narrative more formally into this whole systemic risk governance kind of framework that one wants to think about?
But wasn't the point there that we might not even need the systemic risk governance framework, because the questions are so fundamental that we're dealing with, and you shouldn't leave out the national level, as much as we might dispute its usefulness.
Right. Absolutely.
In actually making sure that locally also vulnerabilities are reduced or resilience is increased. And the example, I think, of our health systems are one of the best, at least if we need to think in those categories for now.
Yeah.
So sorry, that's what I'm thinking, because I'm not sure whether there's any way of putting this into a framework, or whether the term framework is appropriate there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I don't think the term framework is appropriate there, but I'd love to hear other panelists and then.
Yes, maybe I can also briefly comment on this. I think it's 40, 50 years, if not more, that we say that we absolutely need more resources at the local level. However, this is not happening. So why so? And here today we have heard that we need more territorial, well, if the word governance somebody doesn't like or doesn't share, the word governance, more territorial policies, whatever we call them, but something at the local level. We need to figure out why this hasn't happened so far. And what are these root causes that other panelists also mentioned should be really tackled? Because as soon as we start discussing about the root causes at the local level and work with communities, we suddenly realize that the link between national and local is so strong that you need more financing, but to have more financing, for example, at the local level, and to better understand what are the needs and how to better develop capacities and how to analyze the weaknesses out there, you need resources, and resources are coming at the local level if there are human resources at the local level, and there are human resources at the local level if there is a legislation in place at the national level that allocates more financial and human resources. So it's indeed interconnected, I would say. And I still, I am personally, I disagree with others panelists when they say that we don't need to invest on governance. I believe the opposite, that we need to invest on better governance, and we need to, break down silos. And but yes, I mean, the terminology shouldn't be a barrier here because I think we all agree that we need to better address the root causes of risk. We all agree that more resources should be dedicated to this. However, why is this not happening? What are your experiences?
So let me welcome Santosh. He was a little late. Santosh is a professor in the National Institute of Disaster Management. Santosh, would you like to have your perspectives? Would you like to hear what are your views? General views. You're mute. Unmute.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I was listening since beginning itself. So I could hear the narratives which have been given on this systemic risk. I will have 2-3 quick points because the time is also running out, and it's, 2 things. One is that why it is happening at all. First, I would say that who owns the risk and who owns the disaster. This is the very critical questions to be asked in the modern days when we are talking about, because this is a question of visibility and invisibility. So risk is invisible. So nobody is interested on that. And so over the years, this has gone as a kind of unaddressed things. So systemic, when we are talking about, we did not actually acknowledge that what kind of a risk which we are creating over the years in the name of development. So that is number one. Number two, disaster response has been a kind of a very, very kind of a lucrative, and it is very visible. So it suits governance. So that is why it has been the prominence, and so that the prominence has always been given to the response. Despite the narratives have changed at the global level, but the local level it has to be trickled down, which is not happening. Even today, what Anna was telling about this, the resources, the funding and everything is there. Even the expertise to absorb those things, what we have been, what has been created at the global level, at the national level has not gone to. That capacity gap is a serious gap at the local level, which is coming as a creating a systemic one. Third thing which we talk about our own human behavior, because we have been groomed as a kind of a self and personal excellence. And that personal excellence is going also in the sectoral excellence, where we are heading, we are having the territory, and that is going for. So we are not striving for the others' development. So others phenomena is not there. So that we have become so need and greed, which we are talking about, the behavioral change as a social construct, which Andrew was talking about. So that's a very prominence in our own thinking and behavior. So we are trying to achieve our own achievements and glorify that, and we are not investing in the others people. So that is coming as an enhanced inequality every time. So we are saying that pandemic has enhanced the 11 million people more into poverty area. So now when the poverty has increased, so that manifestation of vulnerability is also there. So despite of the resources which the countries have been able to spend over the years in fighting with poverty and inequality, and it has been perpetuated by these disaster after disasters and all. So that itself is a big challenge in creating high vulnerabilities. So there we need to look at that how our disaster management framework or risk management framework, Sendai and SDG can get connected very heavily and can go into that. The third thing which I would like to mention about the literature which we have been able to produce so far. If you see that, if you search, and many of us have been searching and reading those literature, and what is reaching out to the people who are at risk, actually at risk. And the literature they are accessing is there's a very mechanical, this kind of a life in it. And so that literature is a standard operational procedure kind of a thing, very technical in nature. So unfolding risk literature itself is a big task for before us in terms of when we are talking about education, systemic risk, perception of risk, and we are also talking about that how these can go into a kind of a DNA of the people so that start looking at differently. Like when we are so territorial conscious that we are spending huge money in defense, but not in humanitarian crisis. So there is the dichotomy. We may talk about this, but when we talk about systemic risk, where we need to look at that, how we are looking at this whole perspective and whole perception of risk in terms of those. And finally, one point I would like to make in terms of the governance. I have recently, we have been seeing that India faced several disasters during the pandemic time itself, and where we have cyclonic storms and billions of rupees are coming as a kind of in each of the disasters. So what is happening? This is a failure of development. It's not the failure of risk managers. So over the years, what has been done, that enforcement is very, very big, weak, have been the very, very weak kind of. So governance is a real challenging thing. Even if we are, whatever the construction we are making, whether the bridges or the roads or the schools or the colleges, why they get affected by disasters? Why we are in the late in the development literature, economics never talk about the resilience, they talk about efficiency. And today we are talking about resilience. So this is a paradigm shift which we need to look at. So when we talk about systemic risk, poverty is another issue, literacy is another issue, access to healthcare is another issue. And despite this, then what we're saying, dislocation of people is another issue. Long-term recovery and reconstruction, many states cannot afford disaster after disaster, they are thus absorbing. They do not have the money or resources to go for long-term recovery and reconstruction, which we talk about Build Back Better. So what we are saying is in the context of whole reimagining the systemic risk, breaking the stereotype also in understanding risk is to be required. We say that quantified risk is very, very important to understand, but the cascading risk has also posed a challenge. Like if you have a pandemic and then you also have an earthquake, then you have a leading to landslide and landslide to cloudburst. The quantification can be done, which is known risk is there, that yes, the exposure of risk is known, hazard is known, but the hazard is not known even when the cascading models takes place, one after the another disaster. So how that we are combining that dynamism in the model of risk management. So this is the thing which we are thinking as a holistically we should bring into the perspective of systemic risk modeling. Then it comes to the whatever the policy and the acts available to control or to monitor development practices, how honestly it is implemented at all levels. That is also to be relooked and reimagined. I would stop here, sir. And now over to you, and then I will, if the second chance is given, I would definitely like to elaborate.
So someone has asked a question that how do you demystify the assessment of systemic and complex risk? It is so complicated, it is beyond the capacity of the agencies to assess the systemic risks. So how can you make it more simple and then which even the local community can assess?
I would like to make an attempt. This is a very difficult question to answer, but I would like. I was remembering when we were working on with the community, and there we applied many available tools in the other sector and the development sector, which we had, especially when we were talking about the flood risk management, and when we went to the community and sat with the community, and this participatory risk assessment tools, where we are saying that not the quantified version, but this is a very, very kind of a subjective, you can say that based on the perception, based on the experience, and based on the local typology of the hazard. So that kind of a thing were taken into consideration. But of late, when our evolution took place in the terms of modeling and all, we try to apply that also with the community. But community look for as a very, very clear-cut kind of under. They know about their own capacity. What are their social bondages? Like we always see that the animals, the bees and all, they live in the community. But if we individuals don't live in the community, but we talk about the community living. We have become very, very individualistic in the kind of, that human ego has gone very, very high in terms, and that pandemic has destroyed that all ego, whatever that we had the capacity, and that pandemic has brought down to the. So quantification of such kind of a complex reality is still to be explored as a systemic risk. But of course, we can have the blend of the two, one, the quantified model, and also participatory, those models which are giving you the subjective valuation of the risk. So we cannot go heavily on the quantified model, but we can also go as a kind of some experiential and perception-based risk management tools.
But the point is that what we are discussing in the interconnected, globalized world, communities are more often the recipient of the risks. They have no control over it, so they do not have knowledge about it also, because how the global systems are interacting with each other, how society, economy, environment, climate change, and population explosion, urbanization, all these sectors are interacting with each other, create complex risks and compounding the risks. So a small community, isolated community, they would not be able to understand it. So increasingly risk assessment is becoming, in the conventional, traditional sense, okay, the communities know what the local hazards are and they know what the best answer is. But sometimes they are completely baffled. Sometimes they do not have any understanding what is happening. How a small community know how these COVID-19, for example, they have no control over it. They have no agency over it. So they are helpless recipient of the outcome of certain events which are happening, like in climate change. Just small island communities are getting threatened by the sea level rise. And they have no control over it. They do not understand the process about it. It is increasingly becoming very complicated. So I think we are having different kinds of global models and all that. So how do you transmit this knowledge and this understanding to the national governments and to the local governments? Local communities are helpless here. They are helpless recipient of these outcomes of forces which are beyond their control. So how do you empower the local national authorities, local authorities for better understanding of the risks they are going to face? So that is a very, very challenging question.
So we did
any insight on this, Andrews?
Okay, Andrews, please.
Huh?
No, Andrews, go ahead. I was just referring to a case study.
I have worked in the government at all levels, and I can tell you there are severe capacity constraints in the government for understanding this complex nature of risks. So you would be, and even your understanding, Scott and Mark and Andrews, I've gone through all your papers and all that, and it is not so easy. It is quite difficult to understand. We don't have even the basic data on the, for example, doing the vulnerability. You look at the vulnerability, physical vulnerability, social vulnerability, then your environmental vulnerability, and how these forces are operating with each other. Getting basic data on these at the local level are also extremely difficult. We don't have the data sets for doing that. And if you want to measure the risks, you can get some information about the hazards at a macro level. Even the hazard analysis at the local level also is also difficult, and vulnerability analysis becomes extremely complicated because you don't have enough of data available for that. And now these systemics and the complex risks which are emerging, it is quite challenging. But I think somebody who raised the question of demystification of the risk, he's quite valid.
Sir. I would just mention one thing. During the pandemic, we had this opportunity to had this kind of a study of squatters in the urban areas and also the lowest community in the rural areas in Bihar and other places, and nearby NCR in Delhi in the urban area. And during the pandemic, when we were discussing with the community, and they were not in the squatters, they were not having even mask and the sanitizers and whatever the COVID protocol they had to follow. They said that this is additional cost to them and they do not have this affordability. And there was no governance support to them for actually protecting. And fortunately, we did not find a single case of COVID deaths or COVID affected person in the squatters and also in the lowest community in Bihar. So that was a very interesting understanding of risk perception. When we talk about that total urbanite, those who can afford, their risk is entirely different of COVID-19 because it was a risk, but the people who are at the lowest level of the society, they did not find this as a risk.
We have to now, we are exceeding our time already, and Andrews have to go somewhere, and so Scott is also leaving.
Yeah, please
Scott,
go ahead.
any final remarks? Scott, before you leave, any final remarks?
Just to thank you for having the courage to open a space for a conversation of this sort. I think discourse of this nature, this spaciousness that I spoke of earlier, is lacking, and we need to open more spaces for these sorts of conversations. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So any other remarks from anyone? So Upasana, now we can sum up and then with the closing remarks, we'll close it.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Dhar, and thank you so much all the panelists. It's been wonderful hearing you. I think it's, however long the panel discussion may be, it's always short. But nonetheless, I think the few key points that emerge from today's discussion is, this, as I already mentioned in one of my questions earlier, this tension between the local and the global. So while the risks have become more threatening and more complex and interconnected because of the more globalized world, the actual action and preparedness, of course, it has to happen at all scales, but the actual action really has to be at the local level because the impacts are felt at the local level. And the perplexing question is that in this globalized world where the tendency is to centralize power and authority in the hands of few, how do you get agency back to the local people, right? So that is a complex question, not easily answered, but I think that is something one needs to think about if one really wants to think about addressing systemic risks. The second, and one of the ways to do that is to invest more in local governance and local resources, as one of the panelists, Zana, mentioned. Another way is to actually, legitimization of diversity, of understanding how the world works rather than giving universal solutions. Legitimization of the complexity and the understanding of complexity that local people have. We tend to believe that they are poor people who can't really help themselves, but basically we take away their agency. I think the risk is invisible. That's a very, very important point. But I think, disaster seems more visible and therefore gets that kind of response. I think the point that Andrew made, extremely important, so when you want to think of warning systems, it's not just about oncoming hazards, but it's also about understanding which are your vulnerable populations and how do you actually start investing in them so that they are better prepared. And that is completely missing in the narrative. You only assess vulnerability, but don't really think about investing in them in a manner so that it reduces risk. Again, another interesting point is, so the literature that goes out to the vulnerable at the last mile is very dry and technical in nature, whereas you need to bring the idea of management of risk in popular imagination. And that's more to do with how do you bring it in popular media, that is maybe in films, maybe in more fiction literature, television serials, and so on. So some sort of investment needs to be going there as well. And I think the point that Scott made was super important, that this centralizing tendencies at the global level, which do lead to loss of agency at the local level, is really because of the way we think of the economy and the relationship between nature and economy, which is very objectified. Complex questions, no easy answers, but one needs to go on thinking how to answer these complex questions. Lastly, I think a very, very important point raised by Susanne Hanger was, how do you actually think about risk? What does risk mean? Even that understanding is so varied that how do you actually even bring it into objective assessment, right? So with that, I'd like to close for this discussion, and hopefully continue to collaborate with the speakers in the future and have more such discussions. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to Abhilasha for the vote of thanks.
Thank you, everyone. As a final closing remark, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. My special gratitude to all the panelists for such a remarkable discussion, and the moderators, Dr. Dhar and Professor Upasana Sharma. I would also like to thank the organizers, IIT Delhi and DMICS, and finally the IT and media team, Parth, Sandeep and Suparna, for ensuring a smooth conduct of the event. Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.